A few months ago we had a look at a whole load of Japanese wrestling games that aren't Fire Pro. A lot of you seem to like it, so guess what? We're going to do it again. Because, well, there's a lot of games that I didn't mention. Plenty more obscurities, a fair few total dogs, but also some more thoroughly hidden gems that people don't seem to talk about at all. So this time around I'm going to try and be a bit more exhaustive. We have a few more than 10 to talk about this time around, as it's more of a journey of discovery. There's shameless Fire Pro rip-offs, there's alternatives to Fire Pro from the same folks who made the classic series, there's even a couple of Smackdown style games you probably don't know, and there are of course some quite weird ones. So, let's begin. Our first little trio are connected simply by having a wrestler's name on the front. First time out we had Genichiro Tenyu's game, which was a total disaster, but it's not the only one. Indeed, I've picked out 3 others like this for this video, all on the Super Famicom. We're starting off miserable with the first one, but we'll end with one of the best 16-bit wrestling games you can get. In fact, our first title isn't even really a wrestling game, but it's certainly worthy of mention. It's FMW Onita Atsushi! Oh dear. If you're familiar with FMW, you'll certainly have an affection for the almighty Atsushi Onita and his crazy hardcore battles, usually involving barbed wire and huge explosions. They certainly didn't take any half measures back in those days, that's for sure. And so, thanks to Japanese Kosoge favourites Pony Canyon, we have a game featuring himself and other FMW stars such as Megumi Kudo and Riki Fuji that's not actually a wrestling game, but is instead a fighting game. And it's absolutely dreadful. This is the sort of game where I don't really have to say too much. You can see for yourself just how miserable this game is. The jerky movement and shoddy frame rate honestly give this one the feel of a poorly made Chinese bootleg. It's as close as you can get on the SNES to something like, I don't know, VR Fighter vs Taken 2. The moves are so limited, and the only real amusing thing to mention is that you have explosive areas on each side of the screen that you can chuck an opponent in for loads of damage. So hey, this game did that years before Dead or Alive even existed. But yeah, this game is atrocious. The second worst in the whole video, in fact. We'll be covering the worst one at the end. Fortunately, things do get better quickly with Saikyo Takada Nobuhiko from 1995. This game takes us away from FMW's hardcore world and into the land of shoot-style pro wrestling, featuring UWFI's top star Nobuhiko Takada and a bunch of other wrestlers who've had their names changed, but you'll still probably recognise the likes of Gary Albright, Kazuo Yamazaki and Vader, who all make an appearance here. While it's a bit of a shame that you can only move from side to side, you do have a decently intricate bit of shoot-style simulation, with a lot of emphasis on actually getting into proper position for strikes or suplexes, and UWFI's points down system. It feels a bit like a decent boxing game, only the emulation of shoot-style puts this closer to being an early MMA title. The wrestlers are pretty well emulated too, and the game's a healthy challenge. It's quite hard to avoid being suplexed to hell and back by Gary Albright, and you certainly feel like you've taken a bit of a beating when it does happen. Not many people talk about this one, but it's definitely worth a look. Our third game here is an absolute classic. We go further still into MMA land for a game based on Pancrase. Here's Funaki Masakatsu Hybrid Wrestler. Much like the last game, you can play as the early shoot fighting star against a cast of characters who may well be a bit similar to other fighters you may know, although this one's a bit more outlandish. This game is by Technos Japan, and it's a seriously quality attempt at pro wrestling from these guys. There's lots you can do in this wrestling game, with different levels of strikes and grapples, dodging submissions, brawling outside of the ring, springboard moves off the ropes. There's way more here than your average 16-bit game, dwarfing even contemporary Fire Pro titles for variety. and playing it is seriously so much fun. Definitely one of the most exciting and well-balanced wrestling games on the SNES, this one. It doesn't even have to rip off Fire Pro to get there either. This licensed grappler is highly recommended by me. Much like the Fire Pro SNES titles, it is irritating that folks in the West were stuck with the acclaimed WWF titles and WCW Super Brawl, while games like this were kicking around in Japan. Still, while Masakatsu Funaki Hybrid Wrestler is an excellent Japanese wrestling game that doesn't simply take hefty inspiration from Human's masterworks, there's plenty of games that do. And hey, just because a game rips off Fire Pro doesn't mean it's bad. In the first video we had games like Gekito Burnin Pro Wrestling, Jikyo Power Pro Wrestling and JWP Pure Wrestle Queens that were very much homages to Fire Pro, but they were still very good indeed. Today, however, I think we've got the best Fire Pro game that's not officially a Fire Pro title. A game that is in fact so good that it could actually be a match for all but the very best Fire Pro games. And shockingly, barely anyone talks about it at all. We're jumping over to the PlayStation for a look at Taito's utterly awesome Champion Wrestler. Much like Fire Pro, the roster's a mix of the best and most famous names from all the top Pro companies, slightly modified to avoid any kind of copyright issue, but you'll still easily recognise the likes of Jushin Thunder Liger, Masahiro Chono, Misaharu Misawa, Inoki, Vader, Hayabusa. Plenty of major names complete with some lovely illustrations in case you're not sure. The action itself is best described as a slightly more simple Fire Pro, but if you've ever played FP then you'll be immediately familiar with the concept of starting with low strikes and grapples and building up to more powerful ones, as well as the timing based grapple system. But the presentation here has taken a huge leap forward. As you can see, Champion Wrestler eschews the typical isometric Fire Pro view in favour of a more traditional wrestling hard camera, and as a 2D game it looks magnificent. Not only is the move animation just as well crafted as in Humans games, but there's so much wonderful detail. The roving cameraman, the crowd and announcers that actually react dynamically to what's going on in the ring, the welcome addition of some commentary, and tons of moves that fit each wrestler perfectly. Sabu will even magically pull a steel chair out of his crotch and perform an atomic Arabian facebuster. I mean, jeez, this is good. Graphics-wise, it's better than even the most recent Fire Pro game, perhaps. Literally, my only complaint is that there's no option for sim-in matches. I would love to sit back and just watch the game go at it, but playing it is a hell of a lot of fun. This is seriously up there. It may not be all the way original, but it is by far the best non-Fire Pro game that I've ever seen. Ridiculously, there's only a couple of little gameplay videos for it up on YouTube, and not much more. Bloody hell. If you like ProRes and if you like Fire Pro, you need to play this game right now. It seems appropriate, after seeing such a blatant yet brilliant Fire Pro inspired game like Champion Wrestler, to switch over to the almighty folks themselves over at Human Entertainment. We didn't cover their own alternatives to their flagship Fire Pro series last time out, after all, for there's actually a few that ended up blossoming into a pretty excellent 3D wrestling series. So let's have a quick run through of Human, and later Spike's, FP alternatives. Now, I suppose you could start here with Thunder Pro Wrestling on the Mega Drive, which doesn't have the regular Fire Pro name, and was at one point going to be released in the West with Jesse Ventura on it. However, well, it is basically just a conversion of the original Fire Pro Wrestling PC Engine game. It's not too different aside from having a different name, and also being a hell of a lot worse. So we'll move swiftly forward to the arcade, and the first serious non-Fire Pro game, Blazing Tornado from 1994. Now, of course, this is a lot like a Fire Pro title in many ways. The viewing angle is the same, of course, although the sprites are naturally a lot bigger and more detailed to fit the arcade. The biggest change, however, is moving away from the usual timing system and towards classic arcade button mashing instead. And naturally, this does not work at all. Honestly, Blazing Tornado looks okay, but it's kind of a stinker. Fire Pro's grapples just don't really lend themselves well to button mashing, and the game feels grossly unfair as a result, more so than usual for an arcade game. It's just bloody irritating, honestly. I do get why you'd have button mashing in the arcade rather than timing, but this goes so far the other way that it feels like nothing but dumb Eddie Gordo style button mashing will get you anywhere at all with it. Not particularly good this, and it didn't exactly set arcades alight. Or ablaze, come to think of it. So let's go to the PS1 for a game that technically is part of the Fire Pro series, but is so different to all the others that it's basically an alternative. Iron Slam 96. This is, you guessed it, the only official Fire Pro game to be made in full 3D. Aside from that, the controls and view are basically the same as ever, but does a full-on Fire Pro game work in 3D? Again, the answer is no, not really. The 3D makes everything a lot slower, and one of Fire Pro's greatest advantages is warp speed. This doesn't have that. It also makes for a lot of awkward movement, especially from the AI that gets stuck constantly on the ropes or on other wrestlers. This is unfortunate because it makes the game look quite shoddy. It's a shame that there's only a handful of wrestlers to pick from too. When wrestlers come together it all plays fine enough, but there's a bit too much awkwardness here and ultimately it's a miss. Fire Pro's first and last experiment with 3D, the series would go straight back to 2D with Fire Pro G, the next instalment on PS1. If the makers of Fire Pro wanted to do a 3D wrestling game, they'd have to think of something altogether different. And, of course, they did. Now, you may expect me to jump straight to the PS2 and Spike for a look at King of Colosseum, but before that, we've actually got another game entirely that came out in 1999 for the PS1 while Human Entertainment was still around. It's one you may not have heard of, Zen Nihon Pro Wrestling Oya no Tamashi. This is actually the first good Human Spike 3D wrestling game, and it's the almost forgotten bridge between just trying to emulate Fire Pro in 3D and making King of Colosseum. First off, we've got official wrestlers, of course. This is an All Japan Pro Wrestling game, meaning that this does give Virtual Pro Wrestling 2 on N64 a bit of competition. And then you've got the game system. It's a bit like Fire Pro with timing-based grapples and such, but different. There's a lot more positions for grapples like headlock or between the legs and so on. And there's also the Powerball system. You use these either for desperate reversals or big grapples like finishing moves. You've got a limited amount of them and they don't regenerate. The whole point is to, again, simulate the flow and feel of a proper match on the telly, just like Fire Pro. And this game does a fine job indeed, far better than the last two games. And also, for the PS1, we've got some very nice looking wrestler models and a smooth 60 FPS frame rate. This is a total smash. And naturally, it's just a quick leap from here to Spike's King of Colosseum games on PS2, which are, of course, excellent. I have mentioned them in passing a couple of times, although it is fun to note now that the system in place here isn't too much different from the one implemented in the All Japan game, just that this obviously looks better, has more moves and way more wrestlers. We go beyond just one promotion for a game that officially represents multiple major promotions. Indeed, the first game actually had two versions, King of Colosseum Red for 01 and Green for Noah. You could then actually merge the two together for a full game with every wrestler available. Although really these days you're better off just playing the second game, which doesn't do any of the multiple version nonsense and instead has one package with basically all the wrestlers you need. Great to look at, fun to play, it's one of the last proper 3D Japanese wrestling games and it remains a classic. Tenuous link time again, and I suppose a game with Colosseum in the title is as good an excuse as any to talk about one of the more popular 16-bit wrestling game series that we didn't mention last time, and another one that's very close to MMA. The 3 Sugo Katukugi Astral Bout games on Super Famicom. These are of course licensed titles for the bad boy himself, Akira Maeda, and his promotion Rins. And we have an interesting evolution here from a first title that's pretty messy and average, to a really in-depth and serious simulation of MMA that could well be considered something of a pioneer in the niche genre. The first one is a bit outlandish. You can play as Maeda and actually fight in the ruins of the Colosseum against some, well, basically monsters, in a sort of MMA shoot fighting style, weirdly enough. The potential is here. The game's not awful, but it is more than a little bit manky and honestly it doesn't feel too much like a SNES title, it kind of feels more like PC Engine. That said, could this be considered the very first MMA game, seeing as how it came out in 1992? Well, that's very possible. We don't have pinfalls or anything like that, with fights being won by either submission or knockout. It's certainly up for consideration as being the first ever, although it is far from the best. Astral Bout 2 and 3 are definitely where it's at here. For the sequels, the whole silly fantasy element was dropped. Now we have a game based on Akira Maeda's real-life Rins promotion, complete with fellow fighters from the company. The second game's an improvement in every possible way, much more of a serious simulation of Rins-style early MMA action, and a good variation in fighters. You may have to watch out for explosive kicks and the like when you're facing Maeda, but Volkan will try and tear your limbs off with 1,000 different submission holds. Not literally, mind you. This is much more slower and measured, a game where you have to tread carefully. Too many strikes can end you pretty quickly, and the last thing you want is to get stuck in the middle of the ring in a submission. Astral Bout 3 is kinda more of the same, only much bigger and better, and both of them together? Yeah, they make for a pretty good early whack at mixed martial arts. Hell, better than the early 3D UFC games for sure. They are quite challenging and tough to get into. I'm personally utterly terrible at them, as you can see, but there's quite a bit of complexity going on under the hood, and it's pretty fair to say that in the early mid-90s, Astral Bout 2 and 3 were quite ahead of their time. You may well want to seek them out. Okay, let's move on to something that's going to be familiar to every wrestling fan, especially those who grew up on PS1. Good old Smackdown. It was such a relief to finally see Smackdown on PlayStation in 1999. Before then, we PSX owners really didn't have much good in the way of wrestling games over here. Power Move Pro Wrestling, WCW vs. the World, that was it. In the West, N64 was undoubtedly the king of wrestling, and sure it would still be even after Smackdown, but at least it gave us something actually pretty good to play, and we could forget about those bloody Acclaim games like Attitude and Warzone. But here's something strange indeed. In Japan, you could play 2 alternative Smackdown games. They were both released in the long running Simple 1500 series, meaning that, yep, they're budget titles. As if you didn't know already how superior Japanese wrestling games are to Western ones, one of the top Western wrestling games on PS1 is given mere budget title status in Japan. But these games aren't bad, and they come with some quite shocking surprises. The first game, simply called The Pro Wrestling, isn't too much to shout about. It is a straight up version of the first Smackdown. You don't get slightly modified takes on well-known wrestlers, mind you. The game's roster is, very weird. It's kind of like what happens when you go into the edit mode and just try to create as odd a wrestler as you can. Most of them are either stick figure thin or utterly massive, and the costumes are outlandish as hell. Does it play any different to Smackdown? Nah, not really, and there's only single and tag modes here. It's not bad at all, mind you, considering that it is only a budget title. However, the second game, the Pro Wrestling 2, this is the one I want to talk about. Again, this is a straight alternative to Smackdown 2 Know Your Role, and it plays exactly the same. We don't have a weird roster this time, instead we do have takes on popular pro wrestlers who you may actually know. You've got the usual modes, and you've even got a Champions Road this time for something more extended. But this game has something special that was never in any Smackdown game. It's got a deathmatch mode. Hell yeah. You can change everything with deathmatch mode. You can fight in a soft tatami ring, or an ultra hard concrete ring. You can have inferno matches, something that didn't appear in regular Smackdown for 10 years. You can even take out the regular ring ropes and replace them with exploding barbed wire. Oh yeah. You can run your opponent into the ropes after beating them up a bit and watch the fireworks go off. This was never, and still has never been, in any Smackdown or WWE 2K game or whatever, and kind of makes this little budget game here a little bit more interesting than just a strange Japanese take on Yuke's popular series. Hell, death matches aren't something you get all that often in any wrestling game at all, so if you like a bit of bloody hardcore action, you may want to have a look at this one, if you can find it. In the first video, I did have a little look at Tukon Retsuden, the official New Japan Yuke's games on PS1 that were mostly Japan only aside from Power Move Pro Wrestling, and did predate Smackdown by a couple of years. So in the spirit of that, here's something more extended. A look at official games by New Japan and All Japan on the 16 bits, specifically on the Super Nintendo. In this pretty hot period for both companies, who had the better games? Well, the answer to this will become clear almost immediately. One set of games are good, and the other are complete trash. There's also a game that Westerners may be familiar with, if they played just about every Western-related wrestling game they could on the SNES. So, who's got the trash games? The answer to that is... yep, it's New Japan. New Japan had 3 official games on SNES, all based on the corresponding year's Tokyo Dome Wrestling World card. All of them are by a not particularly well-known company called Vari, and they are all completely terrible. However, the first is definitely the worst. 1993's Shin Nippon Pro Wrestling Chush Senshi in Tokyo Dome appears to be a complete joke, quite frankly. I mean, look at how this bloody thing moves! I can't think of too many titles that are less jerky on the system. Playing it is just damn near impossible. The movement makes it bad enough, but the CPU is almost unforgiving. They just crowd you out and make it impossible to even move at all. The animation? That makes WCW Super Brawl look brilliant. This is an utter dog of a wrestling game. And yet, it is still not the worst one in the video. Again, that's coming right at the end. The second and third games, Battlefield in Tokyo Dome and Tokyo Dome Battle 7, well, they're a little better. The movement's been sorted out at least. But yeah, they still aren't any fun to play at all. Presentation-wise, these may be a little more appealing visually than the All Japan games, but that doesn't really matter to be honest. Every second of playing these games was a chore and something I have no intention of ever repeating. Thank God that Ukes took over in the PlayStation era, that's all I can say. It's also worth mentioning that Valley made another bad wrestling game on the SNES, Stardust Suplex, which is a Joshi focused title. No license this time, so you just play Jimmy Hart versions of popular wrestlers, but the game isn't any better than the official New Japan titles they made. Utterly rubbish, and the only thing to do is just move on from this cack. Oh, and there's also a version of one of these games for the PC Engine CD. You can now play the game, only there's some FMVs tacked onto it too. Is it still utter crap? Why, yes. Yes it is. Don't play any of these. What about the All Japan games then? Again, we have 3 titles, one simply called Zen Nihon Pro Wrestling, as well as Saikyo Tag and 234 Budokan, all made by Natsume. And you know what? They're actually pretty good. Once again, we have a series of games that's very much in the Fire Pro mould. We're back to the familiarity of tiered strikes and timing-based grappling when you come together. Lovely jubbly. The graphics have a bit more of a caricature feel to them, and they may not be as striking as the New Japan game's bigger models, but holy hell are they more fun to use. It's a simplified Fire Pro and easy enough to get to grips with, but that doesn't mean you can't have something that feels a lot like a wrestling match. There's also cool features like big team battles, and even the ability to construct your own card. I'd definitely give these titles a solid rating. Indeed, one of these titles did come out in the West, sort of. The original All Japan game got a translation and was released for the SNES as Natsume Championship Wrestling. Not exactly a famous release, but it is still a way that you may have seen one of these games before now. The international release doesn't change much at all aside from the wrestlers and their names, so it's still perfectly fun. There's a couple of other loose ends to wrap up here too. A handheld version came out for the Game Boy called Zen Nihon Pro Wrestling Jet. Now, I'm not too sure if the game translates particularly well to the 2-button Game Boy, if I'm honest, but it's not terrible. And there's also the much more strange Zen Nippon Pro Wrestling Fight Dapon. What we have here is a card game of sorts. Both of you pick moves from your hand, and the strongest one wins. It's kind of strange, and I can't really figure out how to play it at all, but the graphical style is quite entertaining. Right, we're going to finish things off with a whole bunch of games that didn't really fit into the other categories, climaxing with one of the worst and most hilarious attempts at a pro wrestling game I have ever seen. What we generally have here are titles that you may well struggle to get to grips with if you don't have an intimate knowledge of Japanese language. Not many of them are straight-ahead wrestling titles, but it is cool to know that they exist. Now, seeing as we last talked about a card game, it's appropriate to start this section with a series I didn't mention in the last video, Wrestle Angels. There's a few of these games here. They got started on Japanese-only computers like the PC-98 and FM Towns. They're a bit anime and in some cases a bit porny, a bit H-game. Here we have one of the cleaner games, Super Wrestle Angels for the Famicom, Super Famicom that is. The game itself isn't too hard to grasp. Again, you both select a move from your hand, and the most powerful one, as designated by number, wins. Did you ever play the old WWF Superstars card game from the early 90s? I did, and it's a lot like that. There's some drawn moves and all that to accompany the action so that it's not just cards, and yeah, that's about it really. It's a casual sort of affair. Staying in the land of Joshi Pro-Res, how about something that's kind of like a pro wrestling RPG? Such a thing actually does exist, sort of. Shioi Rinhei, Twinkle Little Star on the Super Famicom, is also an official licensed game featuring stars from the Ladies Legend pro wrestling promotion like Shinobu Kandori and Noriyota Teino. This is obviously a weird premise, and there's a hell of a lot of text and options to choose from. I can't exactly make head nor tail of it, so I can't really tell you a lot about it beyond its existence, but you may be curious. It seems as though someone did start an English translation of the game, but it doesn't appear to have been finished. Moving over to the PS1, here's something I was able to get a bit more of a grip on. A series of games called Pro Wrestling Sengokuden, licensed by a popular Japanese wrestling magazine. There's 3 of these titles and they are certainly quite niche. These are management style games. You can take control of a wrestler or a promotion, and whichever you choose involves a lot of day-to-day running of things. You choose how your wrestler trains, who they hang out with, or who you want to sign, and ultimately you can put a card together. You don't control any matches, but there is crude yet functional 3D for watching the matches play out. This gets a little better over time. I would almost recommend these actually, if you're into things like this. There's quite a lot of menu action, but it didn't take me too long to start figuring out what each button does. Pro Wrestling Sengokuden 2 is definitely the better one. A highly specific game indeed, but there really isn't too much else like it from back in these days. Certainly not on console that I can think of. Our second to last game is a bit more straightforward. It's just a 3D Joshi Pro Res game that didn't fit into any of the other categories, but it does lead nicely into our final game. Zen Nippon Joshi Pro Res Jodensetsu Yume no Taikosen came out for the PS1 in 1998, and it's an official game for All Japan Women's Pro Wrestling. So naturally this means that the roster is fantastic. Manami Toyota, Kyoko Inoue, Yumiko Hotta, Aja freaking Kon. They're all here and they're all awesome. And the game? Yeah, it's not too bad as far as 3D wrestling on PS1 goes. It plays quite a lot like Yuke's Tukon Retsuden games, to the point where I did wonder if Yuke's made this as an offshoot of sorts, but that does not appear to be the case. Like a lot of these games, I didn't know of its existence at all until I started doing research for this vid, and like a lot of these games, I'm quite happy to have learned of its existence. It's a pretty good 3D Japanese wrestling game on PS1, meaning that basically it's better than just about every other PS1 wrestling game with the exception of Smackdown. And yeah, I know people are going to say, but WCW versus the world! And it's like, well, why the bloody hell did you play that on PS1? Everyone played it on N64. Doesn't really count. Anyway, with that digression over, we now come to the last game. And, hoo boy. It is, as I always say, a doozy. A wrestling game like no other. And for bloody good reason too. This final title, as you may have already guessed, is a Joshi Pro Res title. Indeed, it's another official game for All Japan Women. And it takes us to a platform that I have not looked at before. The PCFX. Oh yes. People always wonder why NEC didn't make a 32-bit console after the excellent PC Engine. And the answer to that is, they did. Unfortunately for them, it was the PCFX, a hideous pile of shit filled with awful FMV games and no ability whatsoever to make 3D polygon-based games. Not only did NEC back the wrong horse, they backed a horse that was already blind and had one of its legs missing. The console was a total disaster, and it wiped NEC off the console map forever. And the wrestling game on show here, Zen Nippon Joshi Pro Wrestling Queen of Queens from 1995, is as good a showcase as any other game for the reasons why the PCFX was a complete failure. It is one of the stupidest ideas for a wrestling game I've ever come across. Of course, you at least have a good roster. Most of the folks from the last game, only Akira Hokuto and Toshio Yamada are here as well. But of course, this isn't 3D. This is FMV. So what do HuniX and NEC do? Well, they put all the wrestlers in front of a green screen and have them do half moves with each other, while also trying to pose menacingly, And they make a gameplay engine that's, this. Two wrestlers side by side, facing you and vaguely swaying about in a "I'm fighting" type of way. Push the buttons, and if you're really lucky, if you've been very good that day, you may do a strike or the wrestlers might come together. Most of the time nothing will happen though, and honestly, I couldn't figure out anything here at all. I can't think of any other wrestling game like this. I mean, I suppose it's kind of like the old microcomputer game Micro League Wrestling, I guess, only much worse. Still, what's really funny here is just how either bad these folks are at conveying the intensity of wrestling in front of a green screen, which is hardly all that surprising I suppose, or rather, how much they probably found this whole thing utterly daft. The most amusing part is capturing the moments when the wrestlers are quite clearly just laughing. They did go to the lengths of having every possible combination of wrestlers do all their moves against each other, but the result of that is seeing the huge Cheshire Cat grin that Yumiko Hotta has on her face when Manami Toyota picks her up for the finishing Japanese Ocean Cyclone suplex. That's funny, and at least these moments break up the game's general feeling of complete and utter lifelessness. This is just a completely stupid and ridiculous idea for a wrestling game that does at least fit the utterly daft console it emanated from. A total failure in all aspects, and one of the worst wrestling games I have ever seen. And I've seen a lot. But hey, it's a nice way to finish the video. I'd just like to take some quick time out to say that if you're into your Japanese wrestling, then you may well be interested in my Patreon. In my Patreon, I do one video all about Japanese wrestling every month. I've now got 10 exclusive videos on there, full-length documentary style stuff. My latest one is on the feud between Dump Matsumoto and Chigusa Nagayo in Joshi in the 1980s, the atrocious Lions vs the Crush Cows. I've got the Misawa and Lesnar videos that you may have seen already. There's a video about shoot style, there's a video all about jobbers, an amazing video that I did, if I say so myself, about Takeshi Morishima, video about the All Japan split in the 2000s. There's lots of cool stuff on there. There's also non-wrestling stuff. That is where the Be Here Now documentary that I did all about Oasis exists. So there's lots of cool stuff on there, exclusive on Patreon. Patreon.com/KimballJustice, link in that in the description. $2 a month to sign up. We'd love to see you over there. So yes, if you're interested, please do have a look. Thank you. Hopefully you've enjoyed this run through some interesting, often good and occasionally bad Japanese wrestling titles. Now there are still a couple out there that may well be up for coverage eventually. There are the likes of Sega's Giant Gram and All Japan Pro Wrestling featuring Virtua, which I have already looked at a little, but could well use something in more detail. We've got the original Xbox Japanese exclusive, the Wild Rins, and Royal Pro Wrestling on 3DO. I haven't found a way to play either of those quite yet. And perhaps there's other games that I just don't know at all. If you know them, be sure to leave them in the comments, and perhaps there'll be enough for a third video all about Japanese wrestling games down the line. But for now, it's time for the closing bells, post-match interviews, and so long everybody sign-offs. Until the next time that we grace the squared circle and see you on Thunder tomorrow. So, bye for now. Thanks so much for watching this video featuring loads of Japanese pro wrestling games that aren't Fire Pro, except for one. Anyway, if you like this video, please do like it, subscribe, do all the good YouTube things, follow me on Twitch because I'm on there quite a lot, and if you really like my stuff, perhaps you'd like to have a look at my Patreon. All this stuff is linked in the description and so on. You could also join this list of very awesome people here: Alexa Jones-Gonzalez, Andrew Dalton, Arcade LY Webmaster, Brian Henniger, Chris, D. Zaliorim Wansuta, Dagorath Dungeon Keeper, Danny Wolfers, David Rose, Dinty76538, Douglas Miller, Dustin Cooper, Gary Samaden, Glunthef, Jayers Manchild, James Brown, Jace Alexander, Jeff Ladd, Kid Cassette, Lucas Kaligowski, Matthias Gramzov, Mike Clayton Travis, Martin Pataki, Nate Milbank, Piotr Margel, Renbimon, Robert D. Felice, Rod B., Rusty Kelly, Sam Stoddart, Seth A. Robinson, Simon Gulliver, Stuart Christopher Brownlee, Tariq Amir, Tim Wald, Tom Kay, Yerka Operator, and to all the rest of the community, thank you so much, and goodbye.